drag and drop and can carry out personal desktop, what would we call it, desktop economic warfare, right? That's what we're talking about.
But that's the beauty of the internet. You don't need to be on the traditional military ground to cause damage.
Yes, but that is not a military problem. Okay,
But
and,
and
the reason I'm saying it's very important to understand this. That's not a military problem because it does not admit to a military response.
Well, it's a philosophical distinction. I just consider the results of the action. And by the results, the country was offline and the economy was crashed.
Yes, but see, as you say, anybody could have done that, right?
Of course.
And it didn't result in the country losing sovereignty. It didn't result in soldiers with guns marching down the street. It didn't result in a victory or defeat type scenario. That's really what warfare is all about.
Well, another interesting point is that you said that cyber spying is only by stealing backup tapes. Well, I've been arrested a year ago, and I was charged for cyber spying, and I can tell you it's not only about stealing backup tapes, but that's another issue.
No, it's
Well, Marines are not stupid to carry along weapons that can be disabled remotely. But unfortunately, one of the most daring future development of the US Army, it's the FCS, Future Combat System, a new DARPA program. It's a $23 billion program, entirely based on deploying a network on the enemy ground. And this is just hackers' stuff. And you can disable your enemy's weapons just by clicking. And in fact, the FCS program has been delayed due to lack of artificial intelligence and due to lack of security.
That's a good point. You've got me there. You've got me there. And in fact, another point you could make is, the Predator drones and these remotely piloted weapons systems are all being done over networks, and they can all be they're all vulnerable to electronic interference with the command and control systems. The only thing I can say about that, and that's something that, if you look back through my various writings for the last decade and a half, I've been saying, we're absolutely insane to be building systems that are so fragile and expecting to be able to field them. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on where we're actually cutting our own throats rather publicly on some of these topics. Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I'm perfectly happy to dialogue
we can
with
continue
you.
in front of a beer. It's all interesting.
No,
things
did
for me.
you have more? Did you have more questions or comments? I'm just. No, go ahead then. If you have more. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Was there another question?
Yeah. Four distinct objectives when talking about cyber terrorists, criminals, espionage, and warfare. I found it funny that you mentioned Liechtenstein, that was recently involved on a scandal involving the German Tax Revenue Service, the German espionage agency, and the cyber criminal for blackmailing the main Liechtenstein bank. How would you describe this mix? Since it's not something really new, it happened also with the US government and the Iran-Contras incident, where there was a strong mix of government espionage, warfare, whatever activities with criminal groups for, like, let's say, laundering the garbage that the US government was doing at that time. So
I think between what you're saying and this gentleman's points, something has occurred to me, which is that there is another form of warfare that is at present really undefined, which is kind of state-sponsored economic warfare, or I don't even know the right words, right? But there is a very interesting phenomenon that has always existed that is kind of at this border between outright warfare and places where you just screw up someone's economy as part of competitiveness or so forth. And that's places where you see these interesting things where the governments are essentially acting in cooperation with shadowland individuals, or sometimes governments are acting as, espionage agencies are acting in cooperation with corporations and so forth. You get, people stealing personal information, attempting to drive up costs. I don't have a word for that. Economic warfare, I think, is really what we're basically talking about. But that's a really interesting gray area. And,
don't you think that your vision of warfare is too focused on nuclear warfare? Because you mentioned about mutual destruction and smaller countries not being able to bully with the US, but effectively US lost the Vietnam War without any use of nuclear warfare.
Absolutely. No, that's a perfect example. That was an example of a war that was lost purely militarily. I'm not saying that the U.S. is going to win every war that it gets into, which is actually a really good thing, because that's going to discourage further adventurism from the U.S. government. But when we're talking about the scenarios that the cyber war proponents talk about, if you read the stuff that if you read the stuff that Win Schwartau and some of these idiots write, the scenarios that they're promoting are scenarios in which military operations are combined with information operations, and the information operations are militarily significant. And I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Only if you're fighting on your own territory, I would guess. But there's an interest of resources in here. You're talking about that's the objective of war being territory. That's disputable. At the end of the story, a lot of wars now have been happening around resources other than territory. And if you're fighting on someone else's territory, and you're subject to information operation or like InfoSec wars and military operations, that could be an issue. Might be not for the US suffering an attack on its own land territory, but overseas, yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. Once you start to move, well, this is one of the things that happens a lot when you start talking about cyber war, is it very quickly, it moves away from kind of the high-end scenario of somebody clicking and crashing somebody's country and then spearheading an invasion. And then you get into these much more nuanced scenarios in which you're dealing with information operations, which at that point, okay, information operations are really another form of espionage, counterintelligence, intelligence operations. Those are things that are serious issues that are not going to go away. Those are actually what I'm deeply concerned about. It's one of the reasons why I've been trying to trash the concept of cyber war, because there's a lot of money that I believe is being spent in the U.S. on let's prepare for cyber war, which is silly, when what we really should be worrying about is other countries' agents working for government contractors and having access to the things that they shouldn't have access to, critical information infrastructure being outsourced to places where it shouldn't be outsourced to. And all of those are huge vulnerabilities for information operations. They're also huge vulnerabilities for information warfare, or whatever you want to call it, economic warfare. This thing that I don't have a word for. But it's places where you simply decide that you're going to cost someone's economy huge amounts of money by interfering with it in a way that's positive to you, but that does not result in a direct military attack or a direct military loss. And I've got the little no more questions flag coming up here.
Just one thought for you. And you mentioned the Chinese attack to Formosa, the possibility of blinding U.S. defense, right? The main question right now is that if the Chinese move, the U.S. would be able to answer to that. What happens if the Chinese had the first move and the situation repeats somewhere like what happened in Georgia? Do you think that people from Wyoming would be able to, or be willing to send their sons to be like slaughtered for Formosa? That's a good question, I guess.
It's a very interesting question.
Before we move on to that answer, just as a reminder, in the interest of time, that will be the last question for this round. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. That is a fascinating question, and based on you know what I without being privy to the necessary information, my guess is that the military leaders of the superpowers, with the exception of Donald Rumsfeld, are not stupid enough that they would think that an information warfare advantage would give them enough of a critical military advantage. Guns and bayonets still carry the day. Tanks in the field are still really what it's all about. And wars are fought only over territory, and packets can't hold ground. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranum. Obviously, a keynote presentation that brings about a lot of interesting discussion, which I'm sure he'll like to follow up with you outside over tea, over coffee break. We're now going to have a half-hour coffee break. What we're going to do during this time as well is we're going to split up the room. So you'll find, for those interested in track 1 after the break, it'll be in this room that you're looking at, that you're at. For track 2, it'll be that room behind you. It'll be split into 2 rooms. So just to let you know, track 1's in this room, and track 2 is in that room. We'll see you shortly after the break. And again, because we're ending at 7:30 this evening, we will need to maintain the schedule quite strictly. So